Hi, thank you. I'll actually begin with a bit of an interesting behind-the-scenes fact. So one of the artists in this exhibition shares Zai's work that you'll see around the corner. It's this kind of encoded Microsoft Word tapestry. And that particular work was actually commissioned for my university, Carr University of Art and Design. It's just complete happenstance. It's all of the data of incoming students that year encoded into a tapestry. So it was really interesting for me to come into the show and see my university's brand colors on the wall. I think it's part of the kind of woven cosmic connections between interlaced and videocraft. So I'm really happy and grateful to be here. And to talk about the fabric of celluloid, which is some of the kind of research that came to me while I was researching Justice Ariel in a research phase for the interlaced exhibition. So videocraft invites us to think about the shared lineage between objects, especially textiles, and moving images. Today, I will in particular focus on analog cinema textiles, which I think will be a bit of an expansion on videocraft's interest in electronic and digital video as well. So mine will be a bit more focused. And I want to begin in thinking about the connection between celluloid and fabric in Paris. So let's go to Paris at the turn of the 20th century and imagine us watching on stage the American dancer Louis Fuller, who performed in France as Louis. Louis Fuller would drape her body in hundreds of yards of delicate silk that she manipulated on stage like a kinetic screen. With her body, she created fluid abstract forms reminiscent of swirling clouds, blooming orchids, and fluttering butterflies, and these striking visual effects were amplified by beams of colored light and patterns that her assistants projected onto the billowing fabric. She's credited with being the first performer to request all the lights in the theater to be brought down, and to work in a darkened space and create these moving images and lights on the stage. So kind of cinema before the cinema. She patented a lit glass trapdoor in 1893, which was the same year that the Lumiere's first film was screened for audiences in Paris. And she used it for a piece she called the fire dance, where she would be underlit from the bottom of these red lights, and to people in the audience it looked as though the stage had burst into flames. And so this is one of many artists' renditions of her performances. She was an inspiration and kind of a muse for painters and sculptors working in Paris at the turn of the 20th century. So this is a kind of visual rendering by Colin and Moser of what Louis Fuller's performances look like. The height of Fuller's popularity coincided with the emergence of another illuminated screen and material visual delights, the cinema, same year. Early film pioneers like Georges Méliès, the Lumiere brothers, Thomas Edison, and Alice Guy found in Fuller's electrifying multimedia performances a model for their new medium. They would hire and record Fuller's imitators, many of them going under the name of Fuller, but none of these women were Louis Fuller herself, who insisted that her performances could not be captured at the cinema. So they would hire her imitators and then hand paint the film prints, frame by frame, pushing the recorded bodies into animated abstraction and trying to replicate in the cinema the effect of her silk stage performances. So there are dozens of these films by many studios. And in them, as the dancer lifts and swirls the fabric, bold hues saturate the moving panels with a mesmerizing rainbow of synthetic painted color. So I like to think of the Serpentine dance as the earliest example of textile animation, and it predates what many animation historians would call the first animated film in 1906. I think about these as the example of the first animated films. But I want to kind of extend the connection between Fuller's performances in these early films beyond the fact that they are cloth on screen, and think about also the materials on stage. Completing the material connection, early film audiences would watch those films projected on a screen of tightly woven linen, cotton, or silk. And the strip that would be running through the projector was itself a plastic ribbon made from cotton. So what if we took the materials of early cinema seriously as creative collaborators? This is a question posed by the Adamant Materials Workshop, which is a research project that I run in Vancouver at Emily Carr University that brings together scholars and artists interested in understanding material history and culture through animation. So film retrospectives and museum surveys are often dedicated to human artists, right? So you'll have a person's retrospective or a particular theme, like a show on memory. But what would it look like to dedicate a retrospective to a material? And I think curatorial work in craft and design actually takes materials more seriously than many contemporary art exhibitions. Another reason I really love this exhibition here. So the material that I want to follow today with you is cellulose. It's the most abundant organic compound on Earth. It's the constituent material of wood. It's what makes paper flexible and why cotton, which is 90% cellulose, can become fabric. In the early movie theater, cellulose was present at least 3 times over through beginning to end. It was the paper ticket that people purchased to get in to watch the pictures. It was the woven silk screen on which the projection was displayed. And it was the film base itself, the substrate that carried the images past the projector. So the history of cinema, as with the history of textiles, is indebted to the same material, cellulose. And in particular, a semi-synthetic version of it called nitrocellulose, cellulose nitrate. So this research is really into material history and science, the culture and science of materials. In 1846 in Basel, the chemistry professor Christian Schoenben was doing scientific experiments in his kitchen, and he was not allowed, but his wife was out of the house. 19th century science was very much a home DIY kitchen science. And he spilled nitric and sulfuric acid on the kitchen bench, and then he absentmindedly wiped it up with his wife's cotton apron. And before she got back, he hung the apron by the stove to dry, thinking it was all good, until it burst into flames. So that's the origin story of nitrocellulose. I love origin stories of inventions. I think they're often part myth, part fact. But I think it's quite telling that the kitchen apron, the cotton apron, is the ancestor of what became known as gun cotton, which is what he called this material, an explosive version of cellulose. Nitrocellulose is popularly known as gun cotton. As a weapon, which is what folks tried to do with this material, gun cotton had a very disastrous and short career. It was more powerful than gunpowder, but it was much less obedient. And the earliest factories built to manufacture it would blow up, sometimes within months of opening. So many countries abandoned production almost as soon as they began it, but its unintended enduring future was not military, because when it was dissolved in solvent as a way to try to undo some of those effects, that compound became a syrup that would dry into a clear, flexible skin. And that is the version of nitrocellulose that really changed synthetic material production. So I like thinking about the cotton apron as the ancestor to celluloid film, to analog production. So the fiber version of that syrup was patented in 1884 as a cotton-based nitrocellulose fiber by a French engineer named Hilaire de Chardonnay, who named it after himself, because of course. So he called it Chardonnay silk. It was the very first artificial synthetic fabric and the first man-made fiber of any kind. But the name that you would know it now is rayon, that actually was coined decades later by an American marketing department that named it after the ray of light because it was a reflectant, translucent fabric, but they wanted it to still sound French, so it was supposed to be rayonnant, you know. So Chardonnay tried to name it after himself, it didn't stick. But this is really where nitrocellulose takes off. It takes off in synthetic fabric production, and it debuts in 1885 in Paris, again at the same time as the cinema. And nitrocellulose, once it becomes exported and produced in relatively high quantities, particularly for textile production, becomes the most important constituent material of celluloid, the very first plastic in the world. So rayon is a semi-synthetic plastic. It's made with, it's largely cotton, but celluloid is the first officially fully produced synthetic plastic. And again, I love the origin stories of this one. So here's the story of celluloid. There was a mass craze for billiards at the turn of the 20th century and not enough ivory production. The average tusk of an elephant would yield 5 balls of sufficient quality. So a leading billiards firm advertised $10,000 in gold for a substitute to ivory. And John Wesley Hyatt, a printer who had no formal training in chemistry, spent a very dangerous year experimenting in a shed behind his house. 19th century science is really great. And again, it was an accident. There are often accidents in these origin stories. I don't know how much of it is an accident and how much of it is you spent 1 year and a lot of money doing 300 things and one of them happened to work. A bottle of collodion, which is what printers use to coat fingertips against hot type, it tripped over the nitrocellulose and it dried into a really tough, clear solid. And that's the term that he called celluloid, named after nitrocellulose. So cellulose and colloid together made celluloid. And he patented in 1868. So this is one of the early celluloid billiard balls that he produced to claim his $10,000 prize as a substitute for ivory. And some historians actually argue that it's mostly wood pulp coated with celluloid. So a bit of an IKEA bait and switch. At the time, it was marketed as being 100% this new plastic material. It was not a complete success. You know why? Because that nitrocellulose, remember how flammable it is? Hyatt later recalled that a lighted cigar applied in the pool hall, right, when someone tried to take their cigar and put it off on the ball would result in a flame. And occasionally, very violent contact of the billiard balls would produce a mild explosion. So not the best for billiards, but really great for a number of other applications that had a bit less of a friction. But going back to that slide back there, this is an early 19th century kind of satirical sketch of nitrocellulose, and you see this like woman's domestic objects exploding in a kind of a heat of passion from the combustible material. So for the first 2 decades, celluloid became very popular and sold as an imitation material, a material that could imitate more expensive materials like ivory or tortoiseshell, coral, mother of pearl, horn, and linen. It was also used to stiffen shirt collars and to create texture and to create architectural structure in garments as a kind of sandwiched middle layer. The company advertised it as an act of conservation. So here's a quote from a promotional 19th century pamphlet for celluloid. As petroleum came to the relief of the whale, meaning as a substitute for whale blubber, so has celluloid given the elephant, the tortoise, and the coral insect a respite in their native haunts, and it will no longer be necessary to ransack the earth in pursuit of substances which are constantly growing scarcer. I don't know why we have to ransack the earth with billiard balls, so there's some assumptions we can make here. But I think it's interesting that plastic is imagined in this period as a conservational substitute for environmental pillaging. And that is often how early cinema is also presented. as a substitute for hunting, right? We're shooting images. We're recording images of the world instead of grabbing pieces of the world. So that's how celluloid is kind of marketed as a substitute for ivory, for coral, for tortoiseshell. But however, many people did equate celluloid with gun cotton, so we do have a lot of urban legends, unverified, about exploding combs and buttons that light on fire, not verified, right? But nitrocellulose remains a combustible material within celluloid. So celluloid, this is Hyatt works in New York, and in the same region in Newark, this material gets the attention of photography producers and enthusiasts because one of the kind of not limiting but defining substrates of photography in this period are paper and glass, which you're able to produce in small quantities, but which are less portable, right? If you're a photographer who shoots on glass, you're quite limited in how many you can take and their portability, but also which you're not able to produce and project in rapid succession, right? So paper and glass at this time are substrates of photography. But an enthusiast named Hannibal Goodwin, who's an Episcopal clergyman in Newark, on his off time when he's not caring for his parishioners in his attic, starts experimenting with celluloid, sets his house on fire a couple of times, and then eventually files a patent for a transparent nitrocellulose film base, and proposes that this could become a substrate that makes possible the filming and projection of multiple images through a lid projector. George Eastman filed a patent 2 years later. He reached the market first, and then they fought over it for decades, over who owned the patent. And then while they were fighting over the patent, a number of European companies quickly set up shop too. So it's interesting that in this kind of moment of copyright patent uncertainty, the material really takes off very quickly. So nitrate film, for the first 4 decades, becomes the substrate of early motion pictures. And you can see DuPont, the same company that produces celluloid for motion pictures, is also producing artificial silk, or rayon, as well as other plastics. Nitrate film is flammable. Nitrate film stock can't be extinguished. Like, there's videos of firefighters trying to extinguish it. It will burn in water and under sand because it produces its own oxygen as it burns. Projection booths had to be lined with asbestos, and if you look at early promotions for early movie houses, they'll say something like, "It's safe, our projectionist is inside an asbestos booth." So eventually nitrate was going to be abandoned at the turn of the 1950s in favor of another cellulose derivative, cellulose acetate, which I'll briefly mention soon, which was engineered not to burn, and which was called safety film. So for much of the 20th century, celluloid film is nitrate cellulose, and cellulose acetate, which was engineered to be not flammable, is called shorthand safety film because it's not going to set your theater on fire. Throughout all of these, so that cellulose acetate. Cellulose acetate was developed by the Dreyfus brothers, first for the military airplane industry, because cellulose nitrate was used to waterproof and windproof airplane wing tarps, which were made of fabric. But they would catch on fire in midair. So the Dreyfus brothers developed cellulose acetate as a different way of processing cellulose. It's not flammable. During World War I, it was primarily used as dope for airplane wings. And then after the end of World War I, they rechanneled that material, inspired by rayon, into their own version of artificial silk, which was called Celanese. So Celanese and rayon, they're the two early artificial synthetic fabrics. One is made with nitrocellulose, and the other one was made with cellulose acetate. So two different cellulose derivatives. Throughout all of these inventions, the most common application of the material was textiles. Sheet celluloid's first grade market was quite literally a fabric plastic composite. So linen or paper would be sandwiched between two thin sheets of transparent celluloid. Then it would be cut, and then you could bend it into collars and cuffs and shirt fronts that didn't need washing, as the advertisements would say. They could be rinsed. This was a major part of the urbanization and modern work culture, where formal attire was expected, but where many workers couldn't afford or didn't have the time to constantly wash and iron their clothing. So celluloid, whether cellulose acetate like Celanese or nitrate like early rayon, were marketed as being imitations of fabric that didn't need the same level of maintenance or upkeep. And in the invention of the cinematograph, that textile connection extended to the machinery of film itself. So the Lumiere brothers' revolutionary cinematograph machine, it was a machine that could both record and project moving images by running strips of nitrate celluloid images past the projector. It used the claw mechanism of a sewing machine as the basis for the claw mechanism of the apparatus. So the Lumiere brothers kind of borrowed not only the textile material, but also a textile apparatus, the sewing machine, as the mechanical prototype for a machine that could run many moving images, over a light illumination. This inspired our enduring vocabulary of film. And here I'm showing just a work by Gibson and Reporter, a duo who make gallery sculptures and installations that often feature the material and apparatus of analog film. And I'm showing this to kind of think about our enduring vocabulary of analog film. So the language of analog film is ribbons, film ribbons. They unwind from spools, and then they thread through the projector. Occasional misalignments during projection reveal the ribbon's perforations and horizontal frame intervals, which look like straight hems, and sometimes are called fringes of the film. And then the rhythmic clattering sound of a rolling film projector becomes an echo of a sewing machine staccato as the device steadily clicks through the ribbon. Raise your hands if you like the sound of a projector. Yeah, so good. That sewing machine staccato that's clicking through the ribbon. Even the textile factory vocabulary holds. So a film still slits down from a wire manufactured roll, which is cut in the editing room like a cloth. So in parallel to the substrate of live action cinema, cellulose also really impacts the history of animation. So it's a material that really underpins not only live action photographic cinema, but animated cinema as well. So in the animation industry, which moved a little bit slower than the film industry, celluloid or cellulose sheets came to replace paper, the paper substrate on which images would be drawn. And this means that instead of reproducing the same backgrounds or the same parts of the image again and again with every single sheet of paper, animators and animation directors could sandwich different layers of transparent celluloid to create increasingly complex compositions. In 1914, Earl Hurd patented the technique of animating on transparent celluloid overlays, and then him and John Bray licensed it throughout the entire animation industry. So different animation studios would license or purchase the celluloid acetate sheets from the same companies. Before the cell, which is how they're called in shorthand in animation, so the animation cell stands for celluloid, originally cellulose nitrate, eventually cellulose acetate. Before the cell, every element of every frame had to be redrawn. But the transparent sheet now separated what moved from what stayed still. And it also did something optical. It gave the drawn animated image the properties of glass. So when you watch cell animation, they often look illuminated, like stained glass films. They're layered without a visible seam or texture of paper, which puckers. And the background can serve as a complicated composition for many minutes of a finished film. So here's an image of the department that was responsible for transferring animators' drawings onto cells. It was known as the Ink and Paint Department, largely staffed, almost entirely staffed by women, who were called Ink and Paint Girls, And this is a kind of historical behind-the-scenes photograph of one of the ink and paint workers showing the different cells of Snow White from as seen in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So the background would often be painted in watercolors and gouache. It would be very detailed, and then the characters in the foreground would be sandwiched with transparent layers of celluloid. And this is a close-up of one of those cells. At the time, celluloid was promoted as a material that was never going to age. But of course, in celluloid acetate, the acid gradually puckers and warps. So on the left, you'll see from the collection of the Metropolitan Museum cell of one of the original cells from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And you can see how the cells will be painted on the back in color, and then in the front, they would be inked with those fine lines. So the detail would be in the front, and then the color fills would be in the back. Cell-based animation was inherently a plastic medium. Even though it was handmade, it was designed to look as if it was artificially constructed. The women who worked in these films were often trained to actually hide the manual traces of their labor in order to create the image of a smooth, uniform surface. So 24 hand-inked and hand-painted images for every second of screen time, hundreds of thousands of cells for a single feature, but often that's invisible on a screen because they were meant to look completely smooth, almost machine-made. The cells were actually quite expensive in this period. Studios would often wipe the images off and reuse the cells. So there aren't many original cells left from the 1930s and early 40s because somebody in an entry-level position of a cell washer would wipe off those images for reuse. I mentioned that many of these departments were staffed by women, and that's because this kind of labor was viewed as being really similar to the labor of embroidery and hand stitching. It required a lot of sedentary labor and incredible control of your wrists and fingers because you had to be able to control the lines that were made and replicate them many, many times. And for that reason, because of the association between embroidery and feminized work, the studio would often recruit women into the role. Cell animation replicated the structure of embroidery, a neat representational surface in the front, and then behind it, that invisible labor that sustained it. And I have another example from Fantasia. So on the right is just a still image from one of the most celebrated sequences in the film, in which this kind of ballet of seeds alights from the sky. It was partly inspired by ballet dancers and by Degas' pastel ballet drawings. And then on the left, you can see the kind of preparation of translucent inks on celluloid sheets that gave some of that diaphanous effect. And then meticulous painting of little highlights and airbrushing of some of that glow in the dust. So incredible amount of labor for meticulous hand labor, kind of almost like stitching and adorning the image for every frame of the film. The effect of tubes floating down from the heavens is the sum of dozens of hands working in a department the studio called the Ink and Paint Girls Department and working on nitrate cells. The connection between textiles and moving image labor that I just highlighted with Fantasia, it extends to the feminized labor underpinning both animation and live action in Europe and North America. So just as in Lloyd Fuller's dances, underneath that beautiful billowing skirt, there's a body that's setting that skirt into motion. That extends to the production of the film itself, as I just demonstrated with Fantasia. Since cinema's early decades, much of the work of manually editing and hand decorating films was assigned to women, and that was really kind of taken up in a lot of depth and detail in Sabrina Schwartner's work, which is in the exhibition here as well. Most aspects of preparing a film that required delicate manual dexterity were defined through the cultural phenomenon prism of weaving and embroidery, and classified as extensions of feminized craft labor. Descriptions of these tasks in popular and industrial publications emphasized socially prescribed feminine attributes like sedentary stillness, patience, nimble control of the fingers, fidelity to work, and a pleasant social disposition. I would not be hired by the department. One can aspire. So in animation, this was the ink and paint department, and in early film, it was the coloring workshop, and then the early editing workshop. Much of the labor of printing, tinting, and hand coloring in early cinema was modeled after the textile industries. These jobs were staffed primarily by women. Sometimes they were hired right out of textile mills, because the finely detailed labor of printing and stenciling color was considered to be similar to needlework and lace work. The process itself also borrowed from textile production. So in Pathé Studios' stenciling workshop, so that's the workshop that would have colored that fuller film I showed you, right? That's the behind the scenes of Pathé's early color production. So in their workshop, each color required its own layer with cutouts to match on screen. And they used the registration stencil pattern of textile block printing and textile stencil printing, and then applied it to painting on film. The materials and equipment drew on vat dyeing and bleaching, the use of mordants, and manual pattern application. So this photograph shows the 1914 version of one such workshop. Hand-applied color was really expensive, like animation, right? Think about the labor power of hand coloring and stencil coloring every single print. It was really expensive. So it was rationed for the most special scenes or special effects. And one place where the expensive decorating was often reserved for was for fashion films and moments of textile effects on the screen. This is an example of an early fashion reel from the Pathé Studio, Mode de Paris, which is showing the latest fashions to audiences across Europe. Fashion newsreels were a genre that often employed stencil color to amplify the visual appeal of garments and associate them with exotic and opulent destinations. This film, for example, features models posed in lavishly decorated showrooms using the technical novelty and sumptuous color of stenciled celluloid to imbue fashion trends with a tantalizing aura. And often the clothes would be made with celluloid, right? Shimmering rayon and Celanese. And then the film itself would be celluloid, right? Trying to create that allure and seduction to the images that would then draw the spectator to the window shop and to purchase these new fabrics. Women were not only the subjects and makers of these images, but also their presumed consumers. So Celluloid's first great color showcase was in some ways a fabric catalog. So all of these early connections, for me, became apparent when I was studying the work of Lin Lai, and I'll spend a bit more time on him in the rest of the presentation. Lin Lai is one of the most influential and widely studied avant-garde filmmakers of the 20th century. And one of the things he's especially known for in film history is that he dispensed with the film camera and he made film directly on celluloid strips as if they were fabrics for painting, dyeing, and stenciling patterns that pulse with their own energy. And it's called often cameraless animation or direct animation. So it's film that does not require emulsion, photographic emulsion, or a camera. It's made directly on celluloid. And that's Lin Lai here in the 1930s, working on a bench, and you can see strips of painted film hung around him like cloth samples on a drawing rack. And when I first studied Lin Lai, this kind of period of his life was often described as this spontaneous invention, that just out of nowhere he invented this method. And because I really like origin stories and I treat them with suspicion, I was really interested in what was happening in his life, and that's why I began researching when I was working on the Interlace exhibition. What was happening at that time that kind of brought Lin Lai to this really influential and pioneering method. So before I elaborate more on that, I wanted to show you a clip from one of the films. So this is a clip from Kaleidoscope. It's the second film he released with this method. The most best known is Color Box, which was also 1935. color box played across British theaters as a kind of a short feature spoosh. And Kaleidoscope was one he released the same year. The film is available online. The colors are not as good as in this restored version, but you can find some of his work online. This is some of the behind the scenes of that film. So when I say he treated celluloid like ribbons, Lenline would paint, scratch, comb, and stencil directly on celluloid film, treating it as a piece of fabric rather than discrete frames. So these are some of the cardboard stencils that were used across his films. Working with panels like these ones, he would stretch and etch sequences of shapes whose size and spacing would match the frames in a strip to create a library of ready-made patterns that he would reuse across films in different combinations. So I was thinking about these films as textile films, and for a long time this was a speculative connection for me. I felt, wow, he really is treating celluloid as if it was fabric. Rather than a series of photographic images. But when I started to do more research on the Lenline's period and pull on those threads, metaphor, they became more tangible for me. And that's because the patterns in the film, which people for a long time thought were abstract and just weren't related to anything concrete, actually draw on Pacific bark cloth designs, so siako and natu and bark cloth, tapa cloth, which he studied as a young man traveling in the Pacific and living in Samoa in the 1920s. So right here at the top, that's one of Lenline's tapa pattern studies from which he did at the Victoria and Albert Museum by copying them out of catalogs. And then underneath one of the studies, there's a little handwritten note that says, synchronize pattern to sound, right? So he's studying textile bark cloth and thinking, how can I set this into motion? So there is that textile connection. And the other textile connection is in the bottom part of the image, because when Lenline moved to London in the 1930s, his very first studio was rented at the back of a studio called Footprints. Footprints was a very important boutique textile woman-run studio in London, patterned after the arts and crafts movement, and Lenline even made a couple of batiks when he was trying to find ways to financially support himself. So he actually worked next to a textile studio at the time that he was working on these films. So aligning with the ethos of the Footprint Studio and inspired by his interest and enthusiasm for Pacific tapa patterns, Lenline's direct animation actually, I think, quite literally brought textile traditions into the cinema by modifying cinema's industrial method of mass manufacturing moving images towards a decorative craftsmanship. So thinking about film as an artisanal decorative craftsmanship. Here's another kind of side-by-side. So these are on the right are the images that you just saw from the clip, and on the left are the stencils. And this particular image right here, this is a very kind of common Samoan tapa pattern that's meant to be starfish swimming in the ocean. And then this one right here is known as the Trocus shell pattern, and you see it appear right here. So a lot of these patterns, like when I actually started thinking about where they came from, you can trace them to Pacific bark cloth textiles. 20 years after he made that film, Lenline returned to this direction with Color Cry. For Color Cry, he sandwiched celluloid ribbons with fabrics and other textures together, and then he exposed the film emulsion to light, producing animated photograms that interlaced threads and gauzy lattices with the emulsion on film. So I'll play a short clip from Color Cry as well. suggest a showcase, but it's as if the film is reading fabrics, right? There's the lace and cotton, those circles, those are plastic shower curtains. They're sandwiched together. There's no photographs in this film. The fabric and other materials like gauze and mesh are touching the weave of the celluloid and impressing directly before those ribbons are exposed to light and then developed. Animated on screens, the textiles hum and buzz with energy, and you see cotton threads intertwining with arid fibers trapped in gelatin emulsion. And something I really love is you also see the celluloid strip itself with those perforated edges. The ribbon of film is imprinted on the film itself, like a kind of a self-reflexive looping gesture. So here are some of the kind of images from the film where you can see sometimes actual fibers, sometimes a cord stretched, sometimes a mesh or semi-translucent fabrics where one fabric is hidden and layered by another fabric. And this is strips from the film layered together. That's the kind of image for advertising this event. These are the film strips from Color Cry assembled together in a kind of a woven grid. Hung together like this, or rather than run through a projector, we can think about these films as almost like a tartan pattern, right? We're reading a cloth. This connection inspired this is the research that inspired one theme in the exhibition that I curated for the Len Center, which Ariel mentioned, interlaced animation and textiles. Whereas a lot of histories of moving images often trace animation to painting or shadow puppetry, I was really interested in thinking about artists who work with cinema's textile lineages. And one substantial portion of the exhibition, this is a photograph of one of the galleries, it was devoted to the fabric of celluloid. And it brought together for the first time 5 contemporary artists who are working with the plastic substrate of film as a textile medium, using woven quilts, tapestries, and stone sculptures. Artists Isabella Brusca-Oldenhoff, Kelly Egan, whose work is in this exhibition as well, Jennifer West and Sabrina Schwantner, who are also in this exhibition as well, and Marguerite Harris. So 3 of them are also in Videocraft. I'm so excited to see some. I've only seen one of Sabrina's works in person, and that was the work I curated for the show. So this is my opportunity to see another one in person as well. Working with the fabric of celluloid past its industrial obsolescence, contemporary artists are now sewing, quilting, and weaving with analog film, refusing chronological media histories that valorize a steady march towards immersive digital utopias, and thinking about the artisanal, handcrafted material tissue of moving images. I want to kind of spend a little bit more time with just Kelly Egan's quilt as one example of the 3 that are in this exhibition. Pursuing a different approach to écriture féminine, or women feminine writing, Egan's film quilts develop a model of feminist cinema that's grounded in domestic labor and craft. So in Ethereum Felix Femina, subtitled as an homage to cyanotype pioneer Anna Atkins, a botanist who made the first book of illustrated cyanotype photographs, uses a cameraless cyanotype process to capture impressions of plant leaves and stalks, as well as a found film about bullying directly onto film celluloid, actually polyester, combining the animated images with found footage in this diamond and Irish chain quilt. And then the quilt is reprinted into a companion film that reads the surface of the film as an editing pattern. As Kelly Egan writes, the relationship between film quilts and projected films at once erase and reveal the impossibility of unoriginal, because the work exists in the space between them. It is both a quilt and a film, it is both a tangible object and a dynamic, illuminated, moving image. The stitches that bind the pieces together twist and crackle on screen in the film like a direct editing track, and the film to me feels like it's about to rip apart or unravel. Emitting muffled tones and scratching pulses, the quilt in its moving image form transforms into a coarse audiovisual blanket. Once again, I want to attend to the material because I won't be honoring cellulose if I'm not transparent. about the fact that this work is actually not made of celluloid, because celluloid in the 1950s becomes gradually replaced by a petroleum-derived fiber named polyester, which was invented as part of wartime World War II engineering. First for military tents and parachutes, and then once again for the fashion industry. Kodak introduced the first polyester film in 1955, and in the 1990s, polyester became the standard base for release prints that run through a projector. So celluloid was a plastic imitation of organic fibers like silk and animal bone, but polyester then became an imitation of celluloid, a petroleum-based replacement for a biomaterial plastic.
Can I ask you a question on the previous slide? I just wanted to understand how it works that the quilt is projected or turned into a film.
Actually, how about after the talk,
Sure.
we'll walk over together and
I'll
we'll see it together.
Because
You actually get to see it.
Yes.
So I'm going to end by thinking about moving images and plastic images together. What does it mean to think about moving images as plastic images? Because plastic is the substrate of analog film, and to some extent the substrate of digital film as well. I have these images here of yet another cellulose derivative of cellophane, okay, also a cellulose derivative. And these are some advertisements for cellophane, okay, thinking about the way it was going to transform culture. All right, I think cellophane ads are my favorite. Cellophane, celluloid, nitrocellulose, silicon acetate. All of these plastics promised an artificial glossy replica of the messy organic real world. Right? They promised, right, or to be engineered materials that would create a glossy, transparent, alluring, seductive, safe membrane between us and the world around us. Now, cellophane, as a footnote, is a biomaterial, so it actually decomposes and composts, but today in cling wrap and sellotape, they're made of petroleum-based imitation. So cellophane itself is actually more rare to find. It's a regenerated cellulose. But what it shares with the others is the promise of a flexible, glossy distance from the real world. Safety, security, and visibility. The wrapped object displayed and untouchable at once, which is not a bad descriptor of getting to see the world in a projected image.